Now look who the real alpha is.
My wife Sarah had been putting in absolutely insane hours at this tech startup in the downtown district. We're talking 12, sometimes 14-hour days, coming home completely drained and emotionally exhausted. I'd find her on the couch some nights, still in her work clothes, too tired to even change or eat dinner. She'd mention her boss Marcus in passing, always with this edge of stress in her voice, always brushing off my concerns with, "That's just corporate culture," or "Everyone deals with demanding bosses." Looking back, I should have seen the signs more clearly. I should have pushed harder for her to find a different job, but I trusted her judgment and didn't want to seem controlling or paranoid. One Thursday in early spring, I decided we needed some quality time together, just the two of us away from her office and all that stress. I suggested meeting for lunch at a place near her building, nothing fancy or expensive, just somewhere quiet where we could actually have a real conversation without her laptop open or her phone buzzing every 30 seconds. She agreed, which surprised me a little because she'd been turning down lunch dates for weeks, always citing meetings or deadlines that couldn't be moved. We met at this bistro with huge floor-to-ceiling windows that let in all of the afternoon sunlight, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture that tries to look artsy. When Sarah walked in, she smiled at me, but even from across the room, I could see it was one of those tired smiles that doesn't quite reach your eyes. We sat down at a table near the window, and for maybe the first 20 minutes, everything felt almost normal again. We talked about mundane stuff, laughed about how terrible my tie looked with my shirt, joked about the weird documentary we'd watched the night before. She actually relaxed a little, her shoulders dropping from their usual tense position. I thought maybe we were turning a corner, that things might start getting better. Then Marcus walked through the door and the entire atmosphere shifted like someone had flipped a switch. I'd never met the guy in person, only heard Sarah's stressed complaints about him when she got home late, but I knew instantly it was him. Everything about his entrance screamed arrogance and entitlement. He wore an expensive tailored suit that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage, a watch that caught the sunlight and screamed luxury, and he had this way of walking that suggested he owned every square inch of space he moved through. His hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place, and he wore this predatory grin that made my skin crawl immediately. He didn't notice me at first because his eyes locked onto Sarah like a heat-seeking missile. It was the way a hunter looks at prey, not the way a boss acknowledges an employee. The transformation in my wife was instant and disturbing. She went completely rigid, her fork actually trembling in her hand. I leaned across the table and quietly asked what was wrong, trying to keep my voice calm. She shook her head quickly and whispered for me to just keep eating. Nothing was wrong, but I knew her well enough to recognize fear when I saw it in her eyes. I turned in my seat and watched Marcus weaving between tables, heading straight for us. He didn't hesitate, didn't slow down, didn't show any awareness of social boundaries or basic courtesy. He just pulled out a chair at our table like he'd been invited to join us, scraping it across the floor with an obnoxious screech. He said my name, Kevin, in this smooth, almost mocking tone that made it sound like I was some minor inconvenience he had to acknowledge. There was contempt dripping from every syllable, like I was disposable, like I didn't matter. Sarah tried to intervene, her voice shaking slightly as she started to say that we were in the middle of lunch and maybe they could discuss work later at the office. But before she could finish her sentence, Marcus put his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that was way too familiar, too possessive. Then, and I still see this in slow motion when I close my eyes, he leaned in close and deliberately let his hand trail down her side. His fingers slipped beneath the hem of her skirt in full view of everyone in the restaurant. He looked directly at me with this cruel, arrogant smile and said I should leave right now. He said Sarah belonged to him now, that she was his. If I had a problem with that, we could settle it man to man, face to face. The words hung in the air like a physical slap. The ambient noise of the restaurant, all the clinking silverware and background conversations, seemed to just vanish. All I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and Sarah's sharp gasp as she shoved his hand away from her body. The way he laughed after she pushed him off, like her resistance was amusing, like she and I were both just obstacles to be brushed aside, ignited something deep inside me that I didn't even know existed. It wasn't just anger. It was something more primal and protective. I stood up slowly, deliberately, my chair scraping loudly across the floor. Sarah's eyes went wide with a fear that wasn't about Marcus anymore, but about what I might do next. And in that crystallizing moment, I understood completely what was happening here. This wasn't just some guy making an inappropriate comment or crossing a professional line. This was a predator who genuinely believed he could humiliate both of us in public and face zero consequences. The entire restaurant had gone silent. People at other tables had stopped eating and were staring at our table. Some had their phones halfway out of their pockets, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold. I leaned forward and told Marcus in a steady, controlled voice to take back his hand, take back his words, and walk away while he still could. He just chuckled, this condescending laugh that made my teeth grind together. He said something about whether I was planning to sue him or write a strongly worded letter, mocking the idea that I'd actually do anything physical. Then he issued the challenge directly, telling me if I wanted to prove myself as a man, we should step outside and settle this properly, man to man. He wanted an audience for this. He wanted to publicly humiliate me in front of all these witnesses. Probably thought he'd push me around a bit and send me home with my tail between my legs while he kept my wife as some kind of trophy. But what he didn't understand was that he'd already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed the moment his hand touched Sarah inappropriately. There was no backing down from this. No diplomatic solution, no walking away with dignity intact. I nodded once and said one word, outside. Sarah immediately grabbed my arm hard enough that I could feel her nails through my sleeve. She begged me not to do this, her voice breaking with emotion. I looked at her, then back at Marcus, who was smirking like he'd already won, and I told her quietly that I had to do this. There was no other choice. We walked out into the crisp afternoon air, and it felt like half the restaurant followed us. People pressed against the windows inside. Others actually came out onto the sidewalk, phones already raised and recording. This was going to be witnessed and documented whether I liked it or not. Marcus loosened his tie with theatrical slowness, rolling his shoulders like an athlete warming up before a big game. He was still playing to the crowd, still confident in his assumed superiority. He gave me one last chance, told me to leave Sarah to him, or he'd take her from me right there in front of everyone. That was the final spark that lit the powder keg inside me. Marcus lunged first, swinging a wild haymaker that telegraphed its trajectory from a mile away. Arrogance and overconfidence make men sloppy, make them forget basics. I blocked the punch easily, pivoted on my back foot, and drove my fist hard into his ribcage. The crack was sharp and clean, echoing off the building walls. He stumbled backward, his eyes going wide with shock, the arrogant smirk melting into something I'd been waiting to see. Genuine fear. I asked him if he still wanted to play alpha, if he still thought he was so tough. He tried to swing again, but slower this time, his movements betraying pain and hesitation. I ducked under it, grabbed his extended arm, and twisted it hard behind his back until I heard and felt his shoulder joint pop out of its socket with a sickening sound. His scream cut through the afternoon air, drawing gasps from the crowd of onlookers. Some people covered their mouths in shock, others kept filming with steady hands. The entire confrontation lasted about 10 minutes from start to finish. 10 minutes of calculated strikes, joint locks, and controlled rage being channeled into every movement. I put him down, he tried to get up, I put him down again. Strikes to his legs that buckled his knees, another calculated hit to his other arm, pressure points and leverage applied with precision. This wasn't blind fury. This was making a point that needed to be made. By the time those 10 minutes were up, Marcus, the untouchable boss, the man who thought his money and position made him invincible, was a heap on the concrete sidewalk. He couldn't stand up, he couldn't walk. His voice cracked and broke when he tried to curse at me, but all that came out were broken groans and whimpers. The crowd had filmed absolutely everything, every arrogant taunt he'd made before the fight, every desperate stumble as he went down, every audible crack as joints gave way under pressure and consequences. Sarah stood frozen about 10 feet away, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of release, of something breaking free inside her. I stood over Marcus, chest heaving with exertion, and told him in a cold, flat voice that if he ever touched Sarah again, if he ever even looked at her wrong, he'd lose more than just bones. Then I turned and walked back inside the bistro, leaving him writhing on the pavement while his reputation and sense of invincibility shattered around him like broken glass. The police arrived faster than I expected, their sirens cutting through the afternoon within minutes. By the time they got there, Marcus was still curled up on the pavement, clutching his dislocated arm, his face twisted into a mask of rage and physical agony. A couple of bystanders were already eagerly approaching the officers, shoving their phones forward to show footage they'd just recorded. talking over each other to give their versions of what happened. An officer ordered me to step back, his hand hovering near his holster in that way cops do when they're not sure if a situation is fully contained. I raised both palms slowly in a non-threatening gesture and said clearly that I defended my wife, that they should check the security cameras inside the restaurant if they wanted to see what really happened. My voice was steady, but my heart was still pounding like a drum. Sarah's voice shook as she spoke up, telling the officers that Marcus had put his hands on her, that he'd groped her right there in the restaurant where everyone could see. The officers exchanged meaningful glances with each other. This clearly wasn't going to turn into a simple he said situation, not with half a restaurant full of witnesses and security footage waiting to be reviewed. The hostess from inside came out onto the sidewalk, pointing directly at Marcus and confirming loudly that he'd groped Sarah right in front of her husband, that everyone inside had seen it happen. A middle-aged man wearing glasses stepped forward and added that Marcus had challenged me directly, that he'd said Sarah belonged to him now and told me to leave or fight. He said he'd heard every word clearly from his table near the windows. The officers were scribbling notes furiously, their pens flying across their notepads as more witnesses came forward. One officer muttered something under his breath about this sounding like textbook attack and maltreatment, and for the first time I saw Marcus's arrogance crack and desperation leak through. He tried to speak, to spin some narrative where he was the victim, but the words came out slurred and pathetic, undermined by his obvious pain and the mounting witness testimony. Nobody was buying his version of events, not with a line of witnesses waiting to give statements, not with multiple phone cameras that had captured everything, not with security footage that would back up every claim. I was taken to the police station for questioning, which the officers explained was standard procedure in any physical altercation, regardless of circumstances. Sarah came with me, her hand trembling in mine during the entire car ride. At the station, a detective named Monroe sat me down in an interview room and slid a laptop across the metal table. He pulled up the bistro's surveillance footage without saying a word and hit play. There it was, in black and white digital clarity, Marcus's hand sliding up Sarah's thigh under her skirt, the sneer on his face, his lips moving as he said those words about her being his. Then me standing up, fists clenched at my sides as the confrontation built. Monroe closed the laptop with a definitive snap and leaned back in his chair. He said it looked pretty clear that I'd protected my wife from attack, that they'd file the report accordingly and classify it as defense of another person. But then, he leaned forward again and warned me seriously that Marcus was a powerful man with resources and connections, and powerful men always push back hard when they're hurt. He told me to be ready for whatever came next. I nodded, my jaw tight with tension, and told the detective I'd been ready since the exact moment Marcus put his hands on my wife. There was nothing he could throw at me that would make me regret defending her. News spreads at the speed of light when there's drama and violence involved, especially in the age of social media and instant sharing. By the time Sarah and I left the police station and got home, clips of the fight had already gone viral across multiple platforms. Hashtags were trending, people were sharing and commenting. The whole thing had exploded into a full-blown internet phenomenon. But what surprised me was the direction it took. Instead of people condemning the violence, there was this massive groundswell of support and anger at Marcus. Then the floodgates really opened. Employees from Marcus's company started coming forward, anonymously at first, then with their real names as more people added their voices. They leaked internal emails and HR complaints that had been buried. Stories started emerging about women Marcus had cornered at company parties, assistants he'd touched inappropriately for too long, meetings that ended with veiled threats about career consequences if they didn't cooperate with his advances. The pattern was undeniable and damning. The company had no choice but to respond. They issued one of those sterile corporate press releases that said they took all allegations seriously and were launching an immediate internal investigation. But it was far too late for damage control. The internet had already judged Marcus and found him guilty in the court of public opinion. The investigation was just a formality at that point. 3 nights after the incident, my lawyer called me with news that was almost funny in its predictability. He said Marcus's legal team wanted to settle everything quietly. They were offering a civil settlement with hush money attached, the whole standard package that rich people use to make problems disappear. His lawyer told me that Marcus's team knew if this went to an actual trial, even more skeletons would come tumbling out of closets, and he couldn't afford any more broken bones, whether figurative or literal. I leaned back in my office chair, gripping the phone tightly, and told my lawyer to refuse the offer completely. We didn't want silence or money to go away. We wanted the truth out in the open where everyone could see it. My wife was listening to my side of the conversation from the doorway, and when I told her what I'd said, she finally smiled through her tears. It wasn't a smile of relief or happiness exactly. It was the smile of someone watching a monster finally face consequences after years of getting away with everything. Marcus thought he was untouchable, protected by his position and wealth. That day on the sidewalk outside the bistro, I'd broken his bones and his arrogance. But now, watching everything unfold, I realized the world was breaking something even more important: his legacy and his future. The trial, when it finally happened several months later, was absolutely brutal to watch. Marcus's lawyers came out swinging hard, as expected. They wore suits that probably cost more than most people earn in a year, spoke with smooth, practiced voices like honey over gravel, and presented this narrative of me as a violent, unstable husband who'd lost control in a public place over a minor misunderstanding. Every word was calculated to paint me as the aggressor, and Marcus as somehow the victim. But every single time they tried to build that narrative, the actual evidence tore it apart. The prosecution rolled the restaurant's surveillance footage on a massive courtroom screen that everyone could see clearly. The jury leaned forward in their seats, watching in heavy silence as Marcus's hand slid under my wife's skirt on camera. You could see Sarah's gasp, see her physically shove his hand away, see his sneer as he said those words that were clear even without audio. "Leave, she's mine now, or face me man to man." The courtroom went absolutely still. Even the judge shifted uncomfortably in his elevated seat, his expression difficult to read, but clearly disturbed by what he was witnessing. The hostess from the bistro testified first, her voice clear and steady as she stated that Marcus had touched Sarah inappropriately, that Sarah had told him to stop, that everyone in the restaurant had seen it happen. She wasn't hedging or softening her words, just stating facts. The man with glasses testified next, describing how Marcus had provoked the fight, how he'd explicitly said Sarah belonged to him, how he'd never seen anything like it in his life. More patrons followed, 3, then 4, then 5 people who'd been eating lunch that day and witnessed everything. Each testimony was another nail being hammered into the coffin of Marcus's defense. By the time the witnesses were done, his expensive lawyers looked like they were drowning in evidence. But the real devastating blow came when the prosecution introduced documents from the corporate investigation. Multiple formal complaints against Marcus spanning several years, HR records that had been quietly filed under resolved informally, which everyone in the courtroom understood meant swept under the rug and buried. Assistants describing being groped, meetings where they'd been cornered physically, veiled threats about what would happen to their careers if they complained. The pattern was undeniable and sickening. One woman, tears streaming down her face, testified in a breaking voice that she'd thought nobody would ever believe her story until she saw the viral video of what Marcus did to Sarah. Her testimony hit the courtroom like a physical force. The jury didn't just see an arrogant man who'd made a mistake anymore. They saw a serial predator who'd been enabled and protected for years by a system that valued power over people. When it was finally Marcus's turn to testify in his own defense, he tried desperately to resurrect some of his old swagger. He spoke about being misunderstood, about friendly gestures being blown completely out of proportion by people with agendas, about how corporate culture sometimes involves casual touching that's misinterpreted. But then the prosecution played the audio recordings that bystanders had captured on their phones. His voice, dripping with arrogance and entitlement, saying, "Leave, she's mine now," echoed through the courtroom speakers again. Whatever shreds of confidence he'd managed to project crumbled completely in that moment. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, which in legal terms is almost unheard of for a case with this many components. When they came back, the verdict was clear and unanimous: guilty of maltreatment and guilty of attack. The charges against me for excessive force were dismissed entirely. The judge's final words are still etched into my memory. He looked directly at Marcus and said that the law is not a shield for predation, that actions have consequences, and that today Marcus would face his. My wife Sarah wept quietly into my shoulder while across the courtroom aisle, Marcus's formerly proud and arrogant figure sagged in his chair like someone had cut all his strings. His empire of intimidation, built over years, collapsed in that single word from the jury foreman. Guilty. For the first time, I saw him for what he really was underneath all the expensive suits and watches and swagger. Not an alpha, not a powerful boss, but a coward being stripped bare before the world. Marcus's fall after the verdict wasn't a sudden crash, but more like a free fall with no bottom in sight. The day after the jury's decision, his company issued a carefully worded statement announcing that effective immediately, Marcus had been terminated from his position, and the company did not tolerate misconduct of any kind. But everyone who'd been following the case knew the real truth. They'd tolerated his behavior for years until he became a liability too large to hide or protect. First went his high-paying executive job, then his carefully cultivated reputation. Corporate sponsors who'd had their logos attached to his speaking events pulled their contracts overnight. His speaking engagements at conferences and business schools were canceled one after another like dominoes falling. The glossy business magazine that had once featured his face on their cover ran a follow-up story titled something like, "From Power Player to Pariah, The Fall of Marcus," with an unflattering photo. Investors who'd backed his ventures abandoned ship rapidly. Colleagues who'd previously kissed up to him and laughed at all his jokes now claimed they'd barely known him, that they'd always found him unsettling. The civil lawsuits started rolling in steadily, one after another like waves. Women who'd been silent for years, living with what he'd done to them, suddenly found courage in numbers, and in Sarah's example. Our lawsuit had been the crack in the dam, and now the flood poured through uncontrollably. The court ordered him to pay substantial damages to Sarah, which for us wasn't primarily about the money. It was about official acknowledgement, a legal stamp that said, yes, this happened, yes, it was wrong, yes, there are consequences. But our case was just the beginning of his financial troubles. Each new lawsuit drained his bank account steadily. The offshore assets he'd thought were safely hidden got frozen under investigation. The man who'd once bragged about his penthouse apartment with skyline views, his imported luxury car, his custom-tailored suits from Europe, was forced to sell absolutely everything to cover mounting legal fees and settlements. By the end of that first year, Marcus wasn't living in luxury anymore. He'd moved to a modest one-bedroom apartment in a cheaper neighborhood, dodging reporters who still occasionally tried to get statements, hiding behind sunglasses like a cornered animal whenever he had to go outside. But perhaps the worst wound for someone like Marcus wasn't the financial devastation. It was the complete social exile. The same men who'd once called him a powerhouse and an alpha and someone to emulate now laughed at him behind his back and made jokes at his expense. The women he'd preyed on, finally free from fear of retaliation, stood tall while he shrank into the shadows and margins of society. His name had become genuine poison in professional circles. Nobody wanted to be seen with him. Nobody wanted to be photographed near him. Nobody wanted to risk the social stain of association. The world he'd once controlled and dominated had turned its back completely and decisively. Sarah and I moved through the aftermath of everything with quiet dignity, trying not to be consumed by the attention and drama. It wasn't about revenge for us anymore. It had never really been about that. It was about healing from trauma and reclaiming our lives. Sarah's nightmares about the incident gradually became less frequent. The tremor in her hands that had appeared after that day slowly faded over months. She began to smile again with genuine happiness, the kind of real smiles that crinkle the corners of your eyes and light up your entire face. One evening, while we were sitting together on the couch, she said something that stuck with me. She said quietly that I hadn't just protected her that day outside the restaurant. I'd given her back her voice, her sense that she deserved to be defended and believed. In that moment, I realized that the true victory wasn't in breaking Marcus's bones or seeing him humiliated. It was in breaking his illusion of power, his belief that wealth and position put him above basic human decency and consequences. Marcus had told me that day that Sarah was his now, that she belonged to him. But the truth that eventually became undeniable to everyone was that she was never his to take or own. The only thing that truly belonged to Marcus was the ruin he'd brought upon himself through his own actions. Months continued to pass, and gradually the noise of the trial and the media headlines faded into the background of the city's endless news cycle. New scandals took over the front pages, new villains emerged for the internet to focus on, and our story became just another entry in the digital archives. But for Sarah and me, life slowly found a new and better rhythm that felt sustainable. Sarah no longer walked into her office building every morning carrying the crushing weight of fear and anxiety. Marcus's name, once a daily reminder of intimidation and maltreatment, became nothing more than an unpleasant memory stored safely in the past. She transferred to a different department in her company, this time working under a manager who actually respected her talent and contributions instead of exploiting her vulnerability and position. Watching her thrive again in her career, watching her come home energized and talking enthusiastically about projects instead of coming home exhausted and near tears. That was the sweetest victory imaginable. The change in her was profound and beautiful to witness. I didn't emerge from everything completely unchanged either. The fight left permanent marks on me, not just in the occasional ache in my hands or the caution in how I carry myself now, but in my deeper understanding of how fragile human dignity can be and how easily it can be stolen. People still sometimes stop me randomly at the grocery store or the gas station, recognizing me from the viral videos. They lean in and whisper that they saw what I did, that I did the right thing, that they admired my courage. But it's not pride that stays with me when these encounters happen. It's a sense of clarity about what matters. I hadn't just fought some random man in a street brawl. I had stood up against a predator who genuinely believed that nobody would ever stop him, that his position and wealth made him immune to consequences. And in doing so, I realized something important about the world. There comes a point where silence becomes complicity, where not acting becomes its own form of action. Sometimes you have to stand up even when it's difficult or scary or might have negative consequences for you personally. I heard occasional pieces of information about Marcus's continuing downfall through various sources and the grapevine. The lawsuits against him dragged on for years, each one chipping away at whatever resources he had left. His fortune that had once seemed infinite crumbled away steadily. Former allies and business partners refused to testify on his behalf, distancing themselves as far as possible. His once feared and respected voice was absent from every boardroom, every conference, every stage where he'd once commanded attention. The man who had declared himself an alpha, who'd thought he was at the top of some imaginary hierarchy, now existed only in whispers of pity and schadenfreude. One quiet night while we were sitting by the fireplace in our living room, Sarah asked me a question that I'd been expecting eventually. She asked if I regretted breaking Marcus that way, regretted the violence and the permanent damage I'd done to another human being. I thought about her question for a long time, turning it over in my mind and examining my feelings honestly. Then I shook my head slowly and told her the truth. I didn't regret protecting her for even a second. I didn't regret ending Marcus's illusion that he could take whatever he wanted without consequences. Sometimes people like him only learn and change when they're forced to experience powerlessness themselves, when they feel what their victims felt. She leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered that I'd taught him well then, that maybe he'd never hurt anyone else again because of what happened. And she was right. It wasn't his broken bones that mattered most in the end. It was the broken cycle, the end of his reign of intimidation and maltreatment. He would never grope another woman at a restaurant or office party. He would never smirk his way out of accountability again. He would never use his position to exploit someone vulnerable. That was the real revenge, the real justice. As I held Sarah's hand, warm and steady in mine, I understood something deeper about life and love and standing up for what's right. Justice isn't always handed down perfectly by courts and legal systems. Sometimes it begins with the simple decision that enough is enough, that you won't accept what's happening anymore. When power finally meets real consequences after years of escaping them, something shifts in the world. People say that revenge is hollow, that breaking someone only leaves you feeling empty inside. But they don't talk about the kind of defensive action that isn't fueled by rage but by necessity, by love, by the need to protect dignity and survival. Marcus thought he was untouchable that day. He thought money and status and arrogance made him some kind of god who could do whatever he wanted. He thought my wife was just another possession he could claim like a watch or a car. And he thought I was just another man too afraid or weak to fight back. But in 10 minutes on a sidewalk, he learned the lesson he'd spent his entire privileged life avoiding. That power without respect and human decency is paper thin, and one strike can make it crumble into nothing. He lost absolutely everything that mattered to him. His career that he'd built over decades, gone. His fortune that he'd accumulated and bragged about, gone. His reputation that had opened doors, completely destroyed. His name, once a badge of success and intimidation in business circles, became a warning that other people whispered about, a cautionary tale of what happens when you think you're above basic morality and consequences. He thought he could break women down psychologically and intimidate men into submission with his position. But in the end, it was his own arrogance and sense of invulnerability that broke him more completely than I ever could have. Sarah and I gained something more valuable than any satisfaction from revenge. We gained genuine peace and freedom. My wife no longer walks through life with her shoulders hunched defensively, no longer flinches when someone approaches her unexpectedly or raises their voice. She laughs freely again without that undertone of stress. She dreams about the future again instead of dreading each day. She is nobody's possession or trophy or target. She is herself, fully and completely. And me? I carry the memory of that day like a scar on my soul, permanent and visible in how I see the world now. But it's not a scar I regret having. It reminds me every day that love is not just about flowers and romantic promises and easy gestures. Sometimes love is about standing up when someone tries to rip away your family's dignity, their safety, their humanity. Sometimes love requires you to be strong in ways you never imagined you'd need to be. Revenge in its truest form isn't always about violence or destruction. Sometimes it's about taking the one thing your enemy values most and showing them they never deserved it, that they never truly had it. For Marcus, that thing was power and the ability to control and intimidate others. For Sarah and me, what we took back was our freedom and our dignity. While Marcus's bones eventually healed over months, his reputation never did and never will. The internet doesn't forget, and the professional world has a long memory for this kind of scandal. In the end, I didn't just break one man on a sidewalk that afternoon. I broke the illusion that he could own us, control us, or take from us without facing consequences. I broke the cycle that had harmed so many others before Sarah, and that is a victory that nobody can ever take away from us, no matter what happens in the future. That day changed all of us permanently. But Sarah and I changed for the better, while Marcus got exactly what he deserved.